Dear listener of Gaudeamus, today we have with us Nizar Rohana, fantastic oud player and composer. أهلا وسهلا نزار، كيف الحال؟
مرحبا يونس، تمام. كيفك أنت؟
بخير، شكرا. It's a pleasure to have you live. Where are you now? How are you now?
I am in Palestine visiting my parents, and we are all fine and safe.
We were deeply worried about you. We heard there was some severe turbulence and you were hosting some families at your place because they were not safe. But it's good to see that you're doing healthy. Things are improving.
Yeah, things were a bit problematic, a lot of violence, as I might say. I mean, of course, you saw the news or something, but now it's calm, and we were most of the time considerably safe, uh, and everything is fine
Good
at the
to hear.
moment.
We're really relieved. And you have something precious with you in your hands. Tell us, what's that instrument? Where does it come from?
Sure. So this is an uh, oud. Um, Actually, this is uh, one of the most popular instruments in the Arab world and the Middle East. And this particular instrument is is local. It's made by a very good friend of mine who started making ouds about 8 years ago. His name is Peter Sayer. Um, and in a way, he's making ouds because of me, or not because of me, but I've been watching his instrument making, from the beginning. And actually, today I'm playing his ouds, so it feels a bit luxurious to have someone so close to you and making your own instruments.
Tailored for you, especially. We should introduce Nizar, but maybe if you might know him already as a player, as a composer, as a performer. He's been around the world, Arabic world and Europe, and many different venues. At the moment, to have a quick fast forward to your current situation, you're also dealing with a PhD, which exactly deals with the relationship between performance, composition, improvisation, right, Nizar?
Yes. So my PhD is dealing with, in general, the relationship between improvisation and composition through the oud, like what you actually listen to in the podcast, or what I'm talking about in the podcast. That's the Taqsim, and that's the improvisation genre in Arabic music. And basically, um, I'm composing these improvisations, so to say. But I think the idea in the podcast, I won't give you much now, because you can get a good idea in the podcast of about what I'm doing. And I've been doing this PhD. It's an artistic research, actually, or practice-led research, or practice-based research. I've been doing this in the Academy of Creative and Performing Arts in Leiden University. The program is called Doc Artis.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for introducing the podcast already, because we're here today to present it, which you have developed especially for Gaudeamus. Thank you very much for that. The title sounds something like Taqsim Journey, appreciating temporal layer in oud improvisation. And I have to say, as always, I have secretly listened to it beforehand. And you guide us in a fine line, first framing the topic of where does Taqsim come from, the oud improvisation that has become so famous, into the latest tendencies of creation, including your own. And maybe it's nice to play the first example that you share with us, explaining how Taqsim might have evolved from singing. And in this example, you can tell us about it right after we've heard it. Voice, qanun, following, going their own way. How does it work?
Yeah, so basically, what was the Qanun doing? What we heard is that the Qanun was following the voice and or imitating the voice, and we call that in Arabic tarjama. I mean, the musical um, term among musicians is tarjama, and tarjama is literally translation. Actually, it's to translate, and it is strongly believed that the Taqsim actually has started from that practice. So the vocal improvisation, what we heard now is a mawal. It's called the mawal, and that's the vocal improvisation genre in Arabic music. And so basically, it is believed that Taqsim started as a tarjama and then evolved into something uh, more independent, especially after the early recording industry, when all the disc recording industry started in Egypt, especially in the beginning of the 19th century. And suddenly you can hear that um, Taqsim were started to be or recorded independently from vocal music.
That's how you frame the topic of your further discussion. You also tell us a little bit about maqam, which is the tuning aspect of taqsim, which is also very important, even if you're going to focus later on the rhythmical aspect of it. But you tell that very personally with your own instrument. You explain one of the maqams which you play for us like this. Which maqam was this?
This was Nahwan, and the, I thought to bring this maqam because the close, like theoretical link to minor. It is
Minor
not
scale.
a minor. Yeah, so like the intervallic structure of this maqam is similar to minor scale. So if I play it, um, so this maqam is quite popular. Actually, it became popular. Yeah, I guess it was quite popular since the recordings um, area, period, and it's quite still popular today among oud players and I mean improvisers in general. Um, and in the podcast, I focus on the temporal aspects of Taqsim, which is something not always easy to talk about. It's a challenge, to be honest. It was a challenge for me also to make this podcast. And though I deal with that in my PhD, but um, I try to think of things in a more simpler way with no like academic um, terms or like avoiding academic terms as much as possible. And I show basically a kind of how can we actually listen to a maqam, or how is the maqam uh, how does the maqam unfolds in a taqsim. So I show that in a very basic way in the podcast.
That's fantastic because you give us sufficient frame to appreciate it and telling us, of course, that there are many other maqams. This one is accessible because it resembles the minor scale, but you also play a few different ones. And then having that vision, you take us straight into some details of rhythmical practice, which are beautiful to witness. And I think it's a fine balance that you chose to give us a few words so we learn some terminology of Arabic musical practice, but also go to the details with such simple expressions as ta 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 here.
Fragment continues like this. Ta 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 ta. This
That is fantastic. I really advise you to rewind, fast forward, flashback, and listen to it a few times because, Nizar, you give us the key of listening to how the patterns are constructed just by singing them out, speaking them out, and then we can really focus and grasp that dimension that otherwise completely escapes our attention. So it's really a key word, the one that you give us by revealing this underlying rhythm.
I so the fragment we listened to was from Muhammad Qasabji. He's a great Egyptian oud player. He died in 1964 or 66. I cannot remember very well. But not only he was a great oud player, he was also one of the pillars of modern Arabic music. And this is a very interesting thing that you see in all, like most of the composers or like the vocal music composers of the beginning of the 20th century were oud players. So they basically composed their music through the oud. And so there is this, maybe this link, which I don't really clearly say it in the podcast, but there is this link between language or Arabic language or poetry and and instrumental or Taqsim, for example. And this bit, actually, the Qasabji's recordings, I have to say that the recordings I talk about in the podcast, it's from the 1920s. So there is also this time limit because of the recording technology, the early recording technology. And you hear a Taqsim in 3 minutes, but it's so rhythmical, so even metric. It has a metricity in it, you know. It's very clear. You have a clear pulse, you have clear rhythmic patterns. It's like looking at a mosaic of rhythmic patterns, and this is what I try to focus on or get your attention in the podcast of how these rhythmic patterns, they're very tiny, but they're, you know, sewed together.
And
Uh,
they really enrich your listening experience once you're sensitive to that other layer of improvisation. There's a few moments in the podcast where you say, well, this is the subject of a different podcast, of course, but luckily you keep us in this thread, in this fine line that takes us through the end. Later in the 20th century, of course, you couldn't avoid presenting Munir Bashir, one of the celebrities, oud players. Second half, 70s, is that, Nizar?
Yeah, so it Bashir started his like worldwide career. He was quite uh, famous worldwide, um, uh, and he started his career in the 70s. He became quite famous in Europe and in America, and vice versa. Also, he that made him very popular in the Arab world, actually. Um,
Just a
and
quick flare of Munir Bashir playing. Unique mixture of being mystical, spiritual, but also virtuoso.
yes, yes. Here, what is, of course, there are many elements that I only focus on the rhythm and the perception of time in a way. Also, so for example, if Qasabji was bound to 3 minutes. He was forced to squeeze his Taqsim in 3 minutes. Bashir could take you on a journey in 30 minutes.
Mhm.
And you can clearly hear that he's looking for spiritual, meditative atmosphere in his recordings, especially this recording. I mean, this is a spiritual, meditative version of Nahawand. And Qasabji is a very rhythmic, metric, in a way, version of Nahawand. So this is the idea I wanted to send to the listeners. And also, one thing that I should mention, and that's something I don't talk about, it's like the styles or like the oud schools in the Arab world. And actually, in the beginning of the 20th century, there was the Egyptian school, and slowly the Iraqi also school of oud playing became popular after World War II, I think, with Jamil Bashir, the older brother of Munir Bashir, and Munir Bashir himself, who made a great career in worldwide. And that's also made the Iraqi school of oud playing quite popular. So this is something I don't really go into, but maybe it's a good chance to mention it. So Bashir brought many new elements into Taqsim, such as dynamics or virtuosity. I would say, like he. I think for him it was important to show his virtuosity. The concept of being a virtuoso be- also became or gradually became popular in the Arab world, and in Taqsim, also in Taqsim or the improvisation genre. So there's a lot to talk about, but time is not
You'll give
always
us a
possible.
list of references so we can publish it next to the podcast. And if people are interested, they can access more historical and recent contemporary examples. This is a very personal journey. You tell us that this has inspired you and made you who you are. And you quote many of the great masters, but which also had a very intimate influence in your current artistic statement, right? At the end of the podcast, you play yourself, and we thought for this interview it would be better to leave that for the listener in the podcast, but we could have you playing live if you think it's a good idea since you have the instrument in your hands.
Uh, yeah, sure, with pleasure.
It's still in tune despite the Palestinian heat.
Yeah, it's quite warm in this room, and the wood is not very happy, but I think it's stable. Uh, I will play Taqsim in Makam Rast. Um, that's also quite a popular Makam. It's played a lot, and um, what I'm gonna do is basically this improvisation. I basically composed it, so I kind of went into details, and actually I can repeat the same improvisation. So it's basically a composition based on improvisation, I would say.
Shukran jazilan, Nizar. We're very happy to listen to you today, and we encourage everybody to listen to your podcast, which is going to be on air soon. This is now May 2021. Feel free to access the website, check the playlist, and listen in all peace to Nizar's podcast. Thank you so much.
A pleasure. Thank you, Jonás.
Ma salama wa shukran.
Salama, ma salam.